Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with short ribs Pizzaiola. That's right, we're doing beef short ribs pizza maker style, which simply means we're going to cook them in something very similar to a pizza sauce. Okay, I guess if we were really going to cook these like a pizza maker, we would be putting them on a pizza. But anyway, this tender braised beef was incredible, and I think rustic Italian home cooking at its finest. And to get started, we're going to crush up 1 can of San Marzano plum tomatoes, using nothing more than our bare clean hand. And one of my earliest food memories is that of my grandmother or mom or aunts doing this at the kitchen table. And I would always try to help them, but my hands were tiny. So after a minute, they would tell me to go outside and play. But anyway, the point is we're going to crush these into a puree, which we will then set aside until needed, at which point we'll move on to season our beef short ribs. And for this, I have about 3 pounds, which is probably going to be 6 big, beautiful short ribs. And what we'll do is season this very generously on all sides with kosher salt, using 1 teaspoon per pound of meat, which is why I'll be applying about 3 teaspoons. And by the way, shout out to the butchers at Pacific Market, who hand cut these for me so they'd be the same size, which is the first official tip in this video. All right, don't buy your meat right out of the case like a total stranger. Make friends with the butcher and tell them exactly what you're making and what you need, and they will be more than happy to cut these to order. And if they're not, go to another store. But anyway, once we have those successfully salted, we will head to the stove, where we'll heat a couple tablespoons of olive oil in a Dutch oven set over high heat. And our first and most important step, besides the seasoning, is to sear these really well on all sides, and hopefully achieve that beautiful brown crust we're always after when we do something like this. Since in general, the more browning you get, the more meaty and delicious your beef will be. So we really do want to take our time with these. And by the way, if you can't find or afford short ribs, which can be a little bit pricey, some big old chunks of beef chuck would also work, since that comes from the shoulder and has lots of connective tissue also. So it will work in a similar way to the short ribs, and it's definitely a little more of an affordable cut. But either way, once we run out of sides to sear, we will turn off the heat and remove those to a plate, and we will let those rest while we make the base of our sauce, which we will start by tossing in some large brown mushrooms that we've simply cut in half, and we'll also toss in a nice big pinch of salt, and we'll set our heat back on to medium-high. And we could just saute these, stirring them occasionally with a spoon or spatula, but I'm actually going to take an extra minute and use some tongs to turn all these mushrooms to their flat side. And then once we do, we'll let those cook until they're nice and golden brown, which is going to take a few minutes, so don't be in a hurry. All right, just like the beef step, we need to invest a little bit of time for best results. And that's it. Once we've gotten some nice color on those mushrooms, and they're looking a little something like this, we will stop and toss in our diced onion, and then we'll cook those stirring for a few minutes, or until they start to turn translucent. And once they do, we will stop and season this up with some freshly ground black pepper, plus some red chili flakes, if we want a little bit of heat, which I do. And we'll also toss in a very generous amount of dried oregano, which of course is a must in any pizza-related sauce. And what we'll do is stir all that together and cook it for about a minute before we add another ingredient key to any good pizza sauce. And that, of course, would be some garlic. And yes, for this, I'm using a very generous amount. And what we'll do is stir that in and cook that for another minute or so, just to take the raw edge off and infuse everything with that garlicky goodness. But we don't want it to cook too long or start to brown. So after about a minute, we will transfer in our white wine, and we will give that a stir to deglaze the bottom. And by the way, a lot of folks would use red wine for this, but I almost always prefer the slightly subtler white wine. And that's it. Once our wine's been stirred in, we can add our San Marzano tomatoes. Plus, we will also do a cup of chicken or beef broth, which, because we're highly efficient, we will pour into the bowl our tomatoes were in to sort of rinse it out and get any of those last bits. And then what we'll do besides giving everything a stir is turn our heat up to high, since we want this to come back to a simmer. And once it does, we can stir in our sweet pepper. And I went with red bell, but almost literally any pepper will work. And that's it. We can transfer our beef short ribs back in, along with, and stop me if you've heard this one before, any and all accumulated juices. Oh yeah, if you ever have juices that have accumulated on the plate, you have to add those back in. And then our plan here will be to reduce our heat to low, and then we'll cover this and let it simmer gently for anywhere between 3 and 4 hours, or until our meat is fork tender. And you don't have to, but usually at about the 2-hour mark, we might want to uncover this and turn our short ribs over. Okay, it probably doesn't make that much of a difference if you do or not, but 3.5 hours is a long time not to touch our meat. So I do like to give these a turn and see how things are going. And that's it. Once accomplished, we'll put the lid back on and let this continue to simmer until, like I said, the meat is fork tender, which is very easy to determine if you have a fork. And usually if one's done, they all tend to be done. But just to be safe, test a few, if not all of them. And once we've determined those are fork tender, we will remove those to a bowl and reserve them while we reduce our sauce, which I should mention is a totally optional step, because if your meat's cooked and you think your sauce is perfect now, you could just move on to final seasoning and service. But generally, I like to raise my heat up to medium-high and let this reduce a little bit, just to intensify those flavors a little more, which besides thickening things, is kind of the main point of reducing a sauce. And while that's happening, if we want, we can skim off some of that fat floating on the top. And how much you should do depends on who you ask. All right, my grandfather would have said don't skim any, whereas his cardiologist would have said to skim it all. So you'll have to make the call. And besides skimming, of course, we should probably give things a taste, just in case we want another pinch of salt. And that's it. Once we've skimmed and tasted, and we're happy with how far our sauce is reduced, we will back our heat down to low, and we will transfer our beef short ribs back in, and we will toss those in our sauce. And by the way, since they're going to slip out anyway, I usually remove the bones before I add the meat back in. But if you want to try to leave the bones in, go ahead, since it does make for a little more primitive, more provocative appearance. But anyway, I went with a more user-friendly approach, and you really can't go wrong either way. And then we will simply let these simmer gently until they're heated back through. And other than a final check of seasoning, that's pretty much going to be it. And while these finish off, I guess we could turn them again, or maybe base some of the sauce over the top, which is what I did, since I knew I was going to have to take some contractually obligated pictures. Oh, and I should mention, you can actually do this all in the oven, in the same covered pot at 325. So if you don't feel like going stovetop, that's an option. I mean, you are, after all, the pizza maker of whether you should be a baker. And as long as our meat ends up nice and tender and succulent, it really doesn't matter. And that's it. After simmering these in the sauce, I gave them one last taste, just to be sure. At which point I pulled them off the heat and proceeded to garnish these in classic Pizzaiola style. And that would be with some freshly picked basil leaves, which I'm actually doing sprigs of on the top, which is just for the pictures, since when I serve this, I actually like to tear the basil up and scatter it over the top. And that's it. My version of Pizza Maker's beef was ready to enjoy. And for the first official taste here, I'm going to go pure meat and just plate one of these up with nothing but the sauce. And as I mentioned, some torn basil. And that, my friends, really was truly amazing. Okay, if you cooked it long enough, that meat's going to be tender and succulent. And if you browned it properly, the flavors are going to be deep and pronounced. And while it is very reminiscent of a pizza sauce for obvious reasons, it is also significantly more savory, and I think much more complex, which is why we really don't want to eat this plain. And we should probably serve this in a bowl with maybe some baked polenta, so we're able to capture all those amazing juices. And yes, in case you're wondering, I'm going to show you my baked polenta recipe at some point. But this polenta, as amazing as it was, will have to wait for its moment in the spotlight, because this video is supposed to be about our Pizza Maker's beef. And we've actually done a version of this dish using steak, which is another much faster version you can do. But I have to say, especially served with something like polenta, this low and slow fork tender version is probably my favorite, and I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.